Well, first of all, to you and to the PAFOW team, a real big thank you, and I want to have a special call out to Lara as well, who I've been working with on this side in Australia. I just want to really say what an exciting platform it's become, and the insights and collective experience that we are able to glean from these sessions has been wonderful, and we can all contribute better to greater people analytics. So a big thank you. I guess as a behavioral technologist, I wedge myself between the complexity of the human mind and the power of technology. And so for the next 20 odd minutes or so, I'm going to focus on a topic which I think has become critical for all of us. It's a subject that may not be your natural comfort zone. And it's a space that in many respects has gone horribly wrong for many data scientists and business leaders. And I'm talking, of course, of how we communicate interpreted data, sometimes casually known as data visualization. And a key reason why presenting analytic findings is not always intuitive is because the two key ingredients, art and science, are considered to be different. And dare I say, among some, cause for polarization. By the way, if you are able to put your webcast into full screen mode, I'd really suggest you do that. I have a very graphical representation today, and I think the objectives that I'm trying to achieve would look much better in a maximum size, if you are able to. Okay, so let's kick off. In the context of this presentation, I really wanted to share a little bit about my own life as an example of how seemingly polar opposites can create a fascinating intersection. So my mum, she was an artist, and she would wake up in the morning inspired to create something based on an idea or a book or a person she met or a dream that she had. And she would work tirelessly in a completely free-thinking way to communicate the essence of her vision through the creations that she made. My dad, on the other side, well, he was a professional soccer player. And while his skill as a soccer player was certainly a form of art, it was also a structured framework of strategy and rules. And their very different perspectives on life had tremendous influence in my life. And it edged me towards wanting to study architecture, which was something both artistic and structured. But I became disillusioned by the mathematics, to be honest, and I really just wanted to get to the end result really quickly. So I quit studying, did a stint in the military, and then landed a job helping an organization implement its very first HR system. This company then sent me back to uni and to study both psychology and information technology, which was not common in those days when I was studying, but it really was the start of this fascinating journey over 30 years for me into that intersection of human behavior and all things technology. So why am I telling you the story? Well, to me, it reflects what I think we often need to achieve in effective people analytics. Not just learning the right skills, but being influenced in a positive way by others to think in a particular way. Okay, so for centuries, actually, the intersection between art and science has given rise to new ways of thinking about our world and the ways that we interact with it. So these two seemingly opposite disciplines, the one which is really compelled by boundless, imagination, I guess, and the other which was really sort of driven by methodical rigor, actually do unite in a shared curiosity to explore. And in the case of people in the work environment, to explore the diversity of people, their behaviors through the data in order to maximize the value and experiences of individuals, teams, and the broader organization. But, the need for data visualization to tell a story is what we call a form of quantified communication. In other words, you're taking something that is quantified and you're communicating it in a visual, easy to understand form that allows your audience to do two things. One, to remember your main point, and two, to be able to reiterate those points to others later on. Something we often don't get right, and it's absolutely critical that we do. The data visualization is best thought of as a subset of communication rather than an artistic or technical endeavor. Although data interpretation is what brings value insights out of the data, it's the data visualization that really allows you to communicate that insight to others. And consequently, and most importantly, move them to some form of action. I mean, how many times have you presented information and it doesn't carry forward or it ends up confusing the audience? So while a good presentation includes data, data alone doesn't guarantee a good presentation. It's not the mere presence of your data that's going to give you your power. It's how you present that data. So Click surveyed about 7,000 people, business decision makers, around about the end of 2018, and found that only 24% of them were confident in their ability to read, analyze, and importantly, argue with the data. So if you have that situation in your organization, you really do have an uphill battle to get those decisions made if you have that kind of condition. But when it's done correctly, data visualization should use the rational evidence of your findings to really make an emotional connection with your audience. And in much of my research and observations, this is the crux of the problem. In many cases, I find people presenting based on their own areas of comfort and expertise, and either lose credibility by exposing their weakness in science or create uncertainty because the audience collectively doesn't really understand. And, I've got a few slides coming up to show you what I mean. They, in fact, quite hilarious, but sadly, they still reflect what often happens in meeting rooms in our corporates today. So I guess the question is, how do we move forward? Okay, so we only need to look back to Leonardo da Vinci to see the crossing of different disciplines and the importance of that. Like many artists, da Vinci realized that in order to portray the world around them in their artworks, he first needed to understand it. To truly depict a person's physique, for example, da Vinci knew that he must first understand how human muscles and skeletons fit together. And he was spot on to say that we need to study the science of art and the art of science. It's having knowledge across the disciplines that really makes us intuitive. And like he said, it will open our eyes and teach us how to see. Now, of course, that doesn't mean that every HR leader must become a data scientist. That's not realistic, or every data scientist must become a behavioral professional. But I like what David Green has suggested. And, he said that we do need to have greater awareness in some skills across both art and science. Not quite his words, but he said something to that. And in his dimension of excellence in people analytics framework, which I'm showing here, he really does emphasize the importance of 4 steps for non-data science leaders. And these are things that we can learn and will certainly help us mitigate the risks associated with poor data communication. And I have some further suggestions later on. But if you look at these 4 things, framing a business question, building a hypothesis, getting your point across, and then implementing and evaluating are things that you could absolutely do even if you don't have deep skills in data science. Okay, so for a moment, let's go back to the notion that science and art are different, at opposite ends of the spectrum, so to speak. Now, there's 2 paramount differences between art and science. The first is that art is subjective, while science is generally far more objective. And the second is that art is an expressed knowledge, most often in the form of subjective representations, while science is the system of acquiring knowledge. But even though these are 2 key differences, both science and art are human attempts to understand and describe the world around us. The subjects and methods that we use may be quite different, and the intended audiences are different, but the motivation and the goals are fundamentally the same. Both artists and scientists strive to see the world in new ways and to communicate that vision. And when we are successful, the rest of us suddenly see the world differently, as Da Vinci suggested, and our own truth is fundamentally changed. In other words, we feel comfortable to move forward and make decisions. So while the one side is heavily focused on process, and the other is really focused strongly on emotion, the optimal position between these two extremes, or in other words, where is the most appropriate form of visual communication, is not something that's rigidly defined. And actually, it's a continuum where we will play out thoughts, conversations, and decisions. And it really is based on your audience, their need, and the context of your output. And depending on that, you may lean towards one or the other side of this continuum that I'm presenting to ensure that you provide that platform for appropriate discussion and decision making. So, for example, when presenting to a group of data researchers, for example, it may be completely reasonable to be presenting information like this, where you show in your R code or your ggplot graphs. In this example, the need may be to ensure agreement with the internal data science team, and the context of your discussion may be to confirm the methodology and approach that you're applying in light of, say, for example, a new data analytic policy or guidelines that have recently been issued. Likewise, if you're speaking to a group of behavioral change managers and marketing professionals, for example, then expressing your company's organogram like this is absolutely fine too. Here, the need might be, for example, to review imagery to support a new company logo, or in the context of the diversity and inclusion objectives of this organization. And by the way, the picture that you're looking at is really interesting, and there's a really interesting story behind the artwork. It incorporates elements of the history of this company, as well as their sort of values and the culture behind it. And it is created with real data. It's extracted from the Havas Group's Workday Talent Space module. There's over 17,000 employees represented in this picture across 247 companies. And what you're looking at is an upside down organogram with that white dot at the bottom being the CEO. So these are extreme examples, and they certainly are useful at the edge of the continuum that I'm presenting. But a critical lesson is not only knowing who you are engaging, but also why you are engaging them. For example, we also have to be careful about making assumptions about your audience. Visually triggered individuals, for example, are not just confined to arty people. So while the last picture is a genuine work of art, putting that in front of, say, for example, your workforce planning board, to make a decision on reorganization, well, it's probably going to shorten your tenure at that company, to be honest. Let alone the damage that it does in terms of the reputation of HR, as well as people analytics resources. So the point that I'm making is that hitting the right spot on this output continuum is actually quite critical. I really like this, and I remember this from my aspirant architect study days. Eliel Saarinen, he was the Finnish-American architect, and he was well known for his sort of Art Nouveau buildings in the early 20th century. And he reminded us that we should not design or present without understanding the bigger context or issue that we're trying to resolve. And I really do love the metaphor around, always design something that to consider its next largest context. So a chair in a room in a house, and so forth and so forth. And often in expressing data analytic insights, we generally are not trying to communicate our expertise in Excel or R or Python or any other creative ability in tools like Tableau or Power BI or no-code platforms. But often we are blinded by our excitement in what we have created, that we want to share it to the decision makers in a format that is secretly showcasing our expertise in a tool or platform, rather than providing insights in the context of the bigger agenda. So it may be graphically impressive in terms of what you've designed, but as Dave Featherston, he's a neuroscience professor at the University of Illinois, said in a Forbes article in 2016 on the subject of art and science, is that scientists and artists who cannot communicate the insights are failures. Now, as cruel and as blunt as that statement is, the more you think about it, the more you realize that it's actually true. Okay, so let's take a quick look at a few examples where the metaphorical chair has been designed in the wrong context. I love this one. I'm pretty sure you can't actually see any of the detail. And it's exactly what the people in the meeting room couldn't see either, where you have this fantastic Sankey diagram explaining energy flows and conversions and usage. Now, it's actually the right visual to show flow and split and consolidation. But this type of display requires detailed individual review and the ability to control, importantly, the time that you have around to do that. It's far better aligned to an individual focus than to a group presentation. And there's almost 100% chance that you will not keep your audience focused by showing this kind of output. But yet, it's almost trying to showcase what you've created as opposed to the objective that you're trying to get to. Here's another one. COVID's pretty popular at the moment. And you look at the left one, it's highly creative and has a lot of information points if you spend the time looking at it. But it's very difficult for people to collectively follow what you're trying to say, let alone make any decisions from that. And the pie chart on the right, well, we all know about the death of the pie chart, certainly if you have an analytics leading, where it doesn't really tell you much. So there's nothing that's really good about either of these two diagrams. Now, remember, a golden rule during any data presentation is to ensure that you have a common understanding. And that's why both of these examples don't support that. And then I love this one. This is one of my favorites. It's from a report entitled, "Why Do So Many Analytics Projects Fail?" And I think it has something to do with those 3D pie charts and the incoherent sort of axes and labels. And, we can laugh about this, but it's funny that we can understand the negative impact of putting your things in or the incorrect place on that continuum that I've suggested. And then this one as well, which is, of course, often we see the misinterpretation of data, either purposefully or inadvertently or in error. So the one on the left, for example, is great because they've got temperature and rainfall on the same scale, and it just doesn't really make a lot of sense. And on the top right one, well, this is the famous one with the 3D tilted pie chart that Steve Jobs used to make it look like Apple was owned the second largest share of the smartphone market when in fact it didn't. And at the bottom right, where you can get inexperience, for example, people not recognizing the Simpsons paradox in this example and presenting the left-hand image unknown to them that, in fact, the trend is actually very different when you de-aggregate that data. Okay, so this brings me to my observations on dashboards. And I'll give you a few seconds just to read the comic strip. I'm sure many of you will be able to relate to this. Now, you may be surprised to hear that, given my appreciation for art, design, and technology, that I'm not actually a fan of dashboards. Now, just to be clear, I'm not the actual platforms. I mean, there's great tools out there, and they do a really great job. Dashboard platform vendors offer features like filters and selectors and no-code scripting, which requires a user to interact with the data and search beyond the averages for specific insights. Now, from a line manager and end user perspective, it becomes too complicated, requires practice and skill, and users may actually find it difficult to replicate the outputs when the underlying data is dynamic. So they simply stop looking at them, and much of your effort is wasted. Now, my point is here that there are, of course, use cases for dashboards, but if you're trying to solve a business problem using data, a pre-designed dashboard is not your best solution. So, no-code and low-code platforms have become a gateway for anyone to become a data analyst. And I put data analyst in inverted commas, without understanding or having underlying skills and awareness. And so as organizations, we should be really cautious about how we put data communication tools into the hands of well-meaning leaders and employees, unless we are taking them through the right level of education and training to support that. Okay, let me come back to the key aspect of linking evidence to emotion. And I want to ask you a question. Do you think it's possible? Can data make your heart flutter? No, Al will say absolutely. But the answer, generally speaking, is yes. And let me explain. We know that art evokes emotional responses. Let's take a look at the Statue of Liberty. It's so much more than just a gift from France to the people of the USA. It really does symbolize freedom and an ideology that many people aspire to. And for many, it's a reminder of a belief system that they have. And we know from a psychological point of view that there are strong ties between belief and emotion. Art also reflects our desires and represents ideals that we deem important. Now, the statue of John of Nepal on the Charles Bridge in Prague, which I'm sure many of you have passed by and seen, elicits strong emotional ties to the meaning of faith and trust in this example. And there's a lot of people who touch the bronze plates at the bottom of the statue as a form of ritual and as a reminder. And for those of you unaware of the story, St. John of Nepal, well, he was thrown off the Charles Bridge in Prague and he was drowned at the behest of the king at the time for not revealing what his queen confessed to during confession. And she also apparently died mysteriously at the hand of the king's favorite dog, which is the picture that you can see here. And of course, engineering art. I mean, who can, ever forget how the emotion of love feels and how Paris drew you to that feeling. So whether it's a picture, whether it's written text, whether it's public art, whether it's a building, whether it's a dance, any form of art can create an emotional link that importantly creates emotional memory. And that's what artists strive for. Okay, so let's take an example of data blending with art to create an emotional link. So what have I got here? Here I've got a graph that really represents endangered animals. Endangered animals often engender emotional reaction. But would this create an emotional link with your audience? So let's say, for example, you were trying to convince your executive to sponsor the local zoo's mountain gorilla survival program. The answer is that whilst the use of a bar graph is not wrong, I think we can do a lot better. Let's take a look. Take a look at this artwork of a lion's face. The ghostly effect immediately draws you in. But what you're really looking at is 25,000 dots. And each dot represents a single animal that is still alive today. As the population number changes, this software-generated image will either become more legible or disappear completely. Now, that draw of breath that you just took, or the involuntary muscle movement of your face, or the involuntary vocal tick, that's an emotional link that you've just made to data. Let's take another look. When you look at this image, I want you to be aware of your own emotional change that's just taken place. As your brain, first of all, recognizes that it's a tiger and simultaneously understands what the fewer data dots actually mean. And now, as we look at this image, what you are experiencing is an emotional realization of the dire situation the mountain gorilla is facing. We can barely make out the face of the animal from the 1,063 dots. But what I can guarantee is you'll remember this picture in 6 months' time, and you'll be able to reiterate the key point. While you might struggle to remember much about the standard bar graph that I showed you up front. It's quite sobering, isn't it? Of course, this may not be the relevant format for your next data presentation, and neither am I suggesting that you should create your data into endangered animal pictures. But hopefully, what I'm showing you is that data can be an emotional trigger. And if you are able to create that emotional attachment, you have allowed your audience to experience deep understanding, and that will allow for easier decision-making. But having said that, can you imagine logging into your company system every day and seeing a dot-generated picture of your CEO in this format, with each dot representing an approval rating for employees? I think that would be a bit of fun for a lot of organizations. Okay, so if we add some additional dimensions to our art science continuum, such as, for example, individuals to group, what we can now do is start plotting different output types to where they have the greater impact. So, for example, spreadsheets may actually be more relevant to give to an individual as to present to a group. And you don't need to sort of keep that as a framework. I mean, instead of the individual group, you may choose, for example, educate or to decide as your lens. And in which case, those options would either move around, disappear, or change completely. So I would say that it's not an exact science of what particular form of communication fits where, but it does depend on the particular need, and it does take some practice. And, designers have a concept which they call design interjections. And it really is a fancy word or way of saying test, and test again. Start with something, see if it fits in your particular audience, in your particular company, and work out what doesn't work. Test it out with some people prior to getting to the meeting. Also, in each of these output types, there's lots of things that you can learn. For example, having the basic knowledge about which charts to use based on your objective is good to know. And in addition to that, there's so much to learn about the impact of colors, shapes, decluttering of charts, and other design approaches to improve your visualization. So my advice is to put the same effort into selling your analysis as you do in terms of conducting them. That's how you will create credibility and trust. So whatever method you use, make sure it supports a common understanding of the problems being discussed, and that your presentation makes it crystal clear what the data is saying. I have this golden rule and says that if I have to spend more than 3 seconds to realize what I'm looking at, then I've created a psychological barrier to my objectives. Now, you might be saying, why 3 seconds? Well, that's 10 times longer than the brain generally needs to recognize and react to something. There's a specific brainwave called P300, which is associated with recognition, and it usually triggers after approximately 300 milliseconds. So even if you're presenting something completely new, the brain should be able to recognize the pattern and understand it within 3 seconds. Anything longer, and you are potentially allowing doubt, fear, and concern to creep into your message, which is something that you definitely don't want. Now, many of you might know Keith McNulty from McKinsey, and he has some really good guidelines. And he actually says communicating analytics results, to non-data scientists in particular, can be more challenging than the actual analytics. I don't agree on him with the non-data scientist side, because I've seen a bunch of data scientists completely disagreeing over something as simple as a bar chart. But here's some of the things that he says, which I think is really important, and I really do like them. The first one, don't jump straight into the analytics. If you're presenting back to the audience, actually the last thing is that they want to see is the actual analytics. They want to know the business outcomes, the business results, the impacts, for example. And that goes for point 2 as well. Don't get caught up in your own methodology and describing that and explaining that. You don't need to do that. So I like these comments or these points, and they really basic and good reminders of how we should live our lives with regards to presenting information. Okay, so I think many of us can relate with this statement. Spreadsheets really did ignite our productivity and decision-making back in the 80s and 90s. And I do think we are at the cusp of a new change. The more pervasive data and analytics is becoming, the better we need to communicate what it is that we're saying in order to spearhead modern decision-making. So I think this saying really does represent a lot of our own feelings towards where we need to head towards. Okay, so thank you very much for your time. I think we're almost spot on, and hopefully some of my discussion has pricked some of your interest in terms of how to better visualize information that we are trying to present, and some of the techniques and tips that you can apply to really make sure that people can make decisions from what you're showing them, as opposed to showcasing your skill that you may have in a particular tool or platform. So thank you very much for your time, and thanks to you, Al.
Hey, Rob, thank you. That was fantastic. I was, as you're getting ready to wrap up, I'm saying, Rob, you're an artist and you're a scientist. It was spot on. It was truly fantastic. It actually spawned the book Switch by Dan and Chip Heath, which you're probably familiar with, which highlights the writer and the elephant. Is that the writer is analogous to the cognitive self, the elephant is analogous to the emotional self. And we in analytics spend so much time and effort appealing to the cognitive self that we lose sight of the fact that the elephant weighs more and at the end of the day drives behavior way more than the writer does. So thank you for driving that home. And I could not agree more that we have a lot of runway to improve how we visualize data and inspire change downstream. So thank you for elevating that in such an eloquent, clear way. Really, really appreciate you.
Thank you, Al. Pleasure.
Yeah. Well, you be well. Hope together see you very soon, and we'll talk more. Yeah. So thank you for bringing us home today. So talk to you soon. Thank you.
Thanks, Al.